Thanks a lot for this kind introduction, and thanks to the organizer for this invitation to this wonderful workshop. So I hope to keep you awake during the next hour. Nap time, I know, but there will be plenty of pictures on the screen, so I hope that it's going to be entertaining. So the outline of the talk. First, a reflection and a kind of typology of how philology and typology do actually mean. Then a small section about the contemporary encounters between philology and typology before moving on to historical linguistic, which I see as a bridge between descriptive work and typology. So philology, so etymologically it refers to the love for the logos, whatever logos can mean. And in this first meaning, philology has really a textual orientation. And you can separate the work of a philologist, the traditional philologist, between three domains: the collection, the analysis, and the interpretation of data. So the collection of data is what we call heuristic. And basically it consists in finding the manuscript. For Egyptology we are not quite done, because we still find a lot of material on site, and I just want to mention here the recent find of the 4th Dynasty manuscript next to the Red Sea by Pierre Tallet and his team, so a ship log, but also a day-to-day narrative of a team which was bringing stone from the Sinai in order to build the Great Pyramids. And in these texts you find new lexeme, new construction, new things that are directly relevant for the work we do. You have these things on site, but also in museum, and I just come back from Turin, where I'm in charge of publishing this incredible manuscript. The rector is well known, it's the most ancient map, and the verso is covered with text. And all these texts are unparalleled. I mean, when I say unparalleled, some of them are hymns, and in another collection with a lot of unpublished material at the FAO, I found a parallel on an ostracon from one of the hymns to Ramses II, which is on the top. And this text, this hymn, is signed by a scribe, which we happen to know. Which means that for ancient Egyptian, we have access to contextualized, individualized data, which you hardly can get for even old English or Middle English, right? The second task of philology is the ecdotic, so the textual criticism. It's not a lot in fashion nowadays, but you still have examples. Recent one by Carsten Poist or Jean Winon, who tries to build new kind of stemma, for example, the unrooted tree by Carsten Poist. And interestingly, in the same issue of the journal Lingua Egyptia, Carsten Poist used the same technique, methodology, in order to reconstruct the Afro-Asiatic genetic affiliation, which is fun, because in the same volume, he used it to reconstruct the history of a manuscript and the Afro-Asiatic phylogenetic relationship. Which you have here. And then you have the hermeneutics with the interpretation of the text. So we have a lot of hermeneutics going on for literary work in ancient Egyptian, and I come back later in the talk on why it matters for philologists and at the end for typologists to have this hermeneutics at work when one does linguistics. Then the meaning of philology was narrowed to the study of historical development of language in the 19th century usage of the term. And this is what I call philology, it should be two, not one, which is the grammatical side. And there you have the collection of examples in historical corpora, of course, which used to be made by hand, and nowadays more and more using electronic corpora, such as the Thesaurus Linguae Egyptiae in Berlin, where you have lemmatized text with full access. And now this summer we put online the first version of the Ramses project, which give access to the text from the New Kingdom. And what is new in this project is that you have both the hieroglyphs but also the glossing systematically added in the visualization of the text, which allow a dialogue between a philologist and linguist who could use this annotated corpus online in order to make up their own mind about what's going on in Egyptian. And then you have the grammatical description, of course, which began with Champollion, and then the famous figure of the Berlin School, Hermann Zette. If on the other side of the sea, Gardiner, Gunn, Czerny, I'm sorry, this is all white men panel, but I did not have Sarah Gold's picture on my computer. And obviously, Hans Jakob Polocki, who is actually, I think, the first Egyptologist who ever did a typological work. Because in his Syntaxe Amharique et Syntaxe Turque, he compared features between Amharic and Turkish, and he says like he was against evaluative typology. He says just like it's something similar coming out, going on between the syntax of these two languages. And it's interesting because in the interview quoted earlier today in Igeret in 2000 and published in 2001, the interview of Polocki, it is mentioned that actually the Amharic focalizing construction inspired to Polocki the idea of the function of the emphatic form as early as in 1936. So this typological work and this knowledge of what's going on in other languages of the world were influential for its work on Egyptian. And then, of course, for the interpretation, the why question, we go to historical comparative philology with the diachrony and genetic relatedness as explanans. So we have two types of philology, the textual, the grammatical, let's say, each time dealing with collection, analysis, and interpretation. If we now move to linguistics properly, and I take by linguistics the post-Saussurean turn, right? We can make a distinction between the collection of data that's going on in documentary linguistics and the descriptive linguistics, which deals with the analysis of the data collected, as suggested by Immelman in his paper of 1998. But then, what is the main field for interpreting, for addressing why question nowadays in linguistics? I would argue simply that it's typology, okay? Because if you take, for example, Balthasar Bickel's account of the evolution of typology in the 20th and 21st century, you notice a shift from what's possible and aiming at a universal theory of grammar to what, where, why. And of course, the what were is up to the documentary linguistics, the descriptive linguistics. And we here have the descriptive categories that Martin talked about earlier today. But the why really is a big concern for typologists, okay? And they have two types of, explanation. It's that you can explain the distribution of feature as historically ground. It goes back to Greenberg and Given. And of feature explained by genetic, cultural, and geographical patterns. And that's the first dimension I would like to emphasize today, seeing historical linguistics as the bridge between the typology and the whole philological field. Right. Philology and typology in Egyptian linguistics. So I'm not talking about early encounters. They have been, extensively discussed by Sebastian Richter in his paper in 2015. And typology as a term, you all know, it's from the very beginning of the 20th century with von der Gabelens, and Jemslev noted that it's the only way for linguistics to become an actual science, right? It's only when doing typology that one reaches a level of abstraction which actually match what is done in other type of sciences. So that's a dream of all linguists and of linguistics as a mother discipline for human sciences to be an actual science. I don't know if it's a good idea, but that's a dream at least. And then we come to Greenberg, of course, and the big boom of typology. What's going on in Egyptian linguistics? We have Polocki, but it's not properly typology because it's an Egyptologist, so to say, doing typology, but he's not doing this with Egyptian explicitly. And then you have Ariel Shisha-Levi, who was doing typology in 1981, but it's Egyptian internal typology. He's comparing what's happening in late Egyptian New Kingdom with what's happening in Bohairic, and he aimed at providing a comparison of features, descriptive similarities. Of course, even within the same language, Egyptian, as a good structuralist, he wouldn't say that it's the same categories in Bohairic and in late Egyptian, but nevertheless, they have comparable features, constructions, things. Also, it's an occasion to establish a disparity between Saïdic and Bohairic, which was not noticed earlier. After Ariel Shisha Alevi, we have the big figure of Antonio Loprieno, who in 88 and 91 produced a different paper, and it's much of a Greenbergian approach to Egyptian. So he is mostly interested in constituent order and things like this in Egyptian. And as noticed earlier today, that's him who in 2003, but actually a talk given in 2000, noticed the typological turn, right, taken by Egyptology. He says, like, the studies on Egyptian language have recently moved away from the concerns of a crossroad generation, if I may use this term, and he means dealing with the heritage of Polotsky and knowing what to do with it, toward a more dialectic approach. And he says dialectic both in the sense of a potential impact of language research on Egyptology as a whole, and in a sense of a more intense dialogue with the discipline of general linguistics. So here he sees general linguistics as helping Egyptology. And yeah, and the other way around, he says also what was previously considered uniquely within the framework of Egyptian are now read in light of general trends in the history of human languages. Actually, as early as 1994, when closing the Crossroad tree, he had a similar observation, saying that he observes a discussion on the role and limits of Egyptian as a case study for general linguistics investigation. So general Egyptian useful for general linguistics useful for Egyptian. And he has in mind people doing formal approach to ancient Egyptian, such as Chris Reintjes on the one hand, but also what is he himself doing in 1991 and 1995, namely providing an account which is accessible to general linguists of ancient Egyptian. And in this trend, we have then Frank Kammersell, who was, as far as I'm aware, the first Egyptologist to publish in a general linguistic journal consideration about the Egyptian possessive construction at diachronic and typological perspective. And then we probably come to one big thing in Egyptology, which is the temps et aspect en égyptien of Jean Winant, who used previous taxonomy of actionality, actions art, and elaborated on it based on the Egyptian data in order to provide a tree and an analysis of the kind of event type and that you find in Egyptian. And he used it mostly, I think, to be fair, as a heuristic tool. But it was received by Ariel Shisha Alevi as though he was imposing the structure, the general structure, so as though he was imposing a way of reading it imported from typology for reading and describing ancient Egyptian. And so this explains why, I mean, this review says, I believe the typological perspective cannot ever replace the internal corpus-based bottom-up description of subsystem. Linguistic typology must ensure from the details up to the overall schemes and not a priori. So that's what he criticized, the other way around. For Egyptian, this is yet Zukunftsmusik. And so one really see here an opposition between someone who tries to, I mean, take idea out of typology in order to apply them to the description of the material in Egyptian, and someone who says, like, wait a minute, we first have to do the descriptive work, and at some point we'll see if some generalization do apply. And it's actually exactly the type of discussion which is going on link type, on the comparative concept and the possibility to gloss things. Because, I mean, you have this kind of endless debate of whether you should or not gloss, whether these glossing are descriptive categories or comparative concepts, and things like this. And so it's actually a nice modern encounter between the discussion nowadays going on in this kind of list and what was going on a couple of years ago about the book of Jean Winan. And of course it has been mentioned already several times, the milestone, which is the book Egyptian-Coptic Linguistics in Typological Perspective. And Comrie, in his preface, states that the studies comprise 11 articles, all of which satisfy the prerequisite of showing how Egyptological, Coptological studies and linguistic typology can mutually illuminate one another. I would argue that this is not true, because if you actually read the book, you have some papers for which typology informs the description, right? Like the conditional in late Egyptian by Marc Collier. But it doesn't go the other way around, okay? I mean, it provides some material, but it doesn't change anything. And then you have typology questioning the description. And then you have this paper from Gensler, I mean, who says like, the neurocomparatistic argues that there is a shift from a voice dental to a pharyngeal. I do not know any shift like this. I mean, please revise your copy, right? So this is basically something like this. And you have one step further, the typologist amending the description. And it is a brilliant paper by Tom Gouldeman, right? Based on his study of quotatives. He says like the verbal origin of this quotative in F. I mean, this is disputable, at least, and I suggest another path of grammaticalization. Here it is, and it's a better and more coherent account of what's going on with this particle in general terms. But in this first trend, it's always going in one direction, okay? The general framework and typology and the conceptual tool and models that are used for, reaching a better description. And then we have the other way around, description that informs typology. For example, Chris Rentiers, the typologically unusual case. And this is nothing new in terms of description of ancient Egyptian, but this is typologically interesting, right? Same for Andreas Stauder, a rare change the degrammaticalization. So the interest here is to show that something is happening in Egyptian, nothing new for Egyptologists, but it's interesting for everyone studying languages to know that such phenomenon do happen in Egyptian. And then an actual dialogue, is it really possible? I mean, yes, Eitan showed something along these lines, taking the generalization suggested by Koenig for Eastern Africa, no case before the verb, obligatory case after the verb, and showing that it's Coptic. It has not been described as such, but it worked along this line. And then you can generalize the generalization by Koenig, extending the Eastern Africa observation to the Eastern Mediterranean area. So, and this is this aspect that I would like to emphasize in the last section about historical linguistics as a bridge between descriptive work and typology. First, I would like to stress strongly that philology remains the first condition, and philology in both sense. The textual philology. Why? I said I would come back to hermeneutics. I just give you an example. In a recent paper about the grammaticalization of an allative future in late Egyptian, we were studying this construction su emnai ersegem, so really typical allative construction. Literally, he is traveling for hearing, for he is about to hear, right? And we were looking for the first occurrences of this construction, and one of the main arguments was that we needed to find bridging context for the motion with purpose and then the imminent future value. And actually the oldest example that we have in the written record could be read both ways. You know, the kind of expedition which I am traveling to make if he sent the letter and the addressee is already traveling, or which I'm going to make, which I am about to make. And it's impossible to decide based on this text what is the reading which is appropriate here. But if you look at the whole late Ramesside correspondence and other letters, you know that he is still in Thebes and did not move away when the letter was sent. So it means that the very first occurrence of this construction in our in the written record is already a future construction and not a movement with purpose construction. And this is only possible thanks to basic philological work and hermeneutics, right? Then the second type of philology is needed. And I would take here an example of the collection of example in historical corpora. With a focus on cyclical change. We have a couple of Jespersen cycles going on in Egyptian, and one of them is the traditional Jespersen cycle with a negation, right? So non, ne pas, and then we end up with pa. It's been studied recently by Johan van der Roera. And for Egyptian, it looks like this. So you first have en, nen, then ben, beniuna, with an emphasis on the second, the post-verbal negator, then ben and benna, or ben in, and then for Coptic, nen an, with the n optional and an, right? So it looks good, but at no stage, at no point of the language, you have the three construction. You have nen and an, though here, this in Coptic is not attested. At least if one read Leighton's grammar. So nothing in this case. But just before coming, Ariel Shisha-Levi sent me a mail saying like, I'm reading Shenute, and I found several examples of just the n prenegation without postnegation in Shenute. That's for sure. You can take them for granted. I'll send you something. And then it means that we have this. I mean, it's rare, but it does still occur. And it's much like in French nowadays. You could say, il ne peut venir ce soir, il ne peut pas venir ce soir, il peut pas venir ce soir. Okay? And so it's a much richer description of what's actually going on in the synchrony of Coptic. And it's also, it also fits well with the three stages of grammaticalization for the adnominal possessive construction described by Martin in his book in 2015. So this is interesting, and this leads me to say something about the expecting the unexpected, because as a philologist we always have preconceived idea about how things should be, and because of textual criticism we often tend to amend, and sometimes amend a bit too much the sentences. And you have here under the eyes a sentence transcription in hieroglyph by Gardiner, and you know you have all these notes B, C saying insert this preposition, perhaps insert this preposition. And what we actually do in our practice is to do so. So here it's a snapshot of the Ramses database, and you see that this this preposition has been supplied in the text. But actually, if you look at the material, you can have a direct construction of verb of motion plus infinitive without this allative purpose marker. So this means that if you take into account all the examples that you have under the eyes, the risk of the normative philology should also be avoided, and we should be ready to expect the unexpected. So let's move now to the actual dialogue between philology and typology. I would like to illustrate this with a study that we made with Eitan of the earlier Egyptian allative future and the typology of allative future. In this paper, we study this construction, EU, F, sejam, an auxiliary, I mean, basically realis or something like this, E to ear. And this construction has been analyzed by Pascal Vernus in a remarkable book about future tenses in ancient Egyptian. And he says that the relationship between the action and its subject does not stem from the speaker or writer's intention or expectation. Rather, the subject is bound to the fulfillment of the action, right? So some kind of deontic future originally. But then, in the very earliest occurrence, you have cases like this, where it says, if you continue day and night being concerned with doing what your Lord loves, prizes, and commands, His Majesty will fulfill your many worthy aspiration. And if you read it with a deontic meaning, it means His Majesty, the king, will have to fulfill. And I mean, how could you possibly imagine that the king will have to do something in the ancient Egyptian cultural environment? And then this philological question, we looked at the text with Eitan and we said, well, this is nevertheless problematic. And he says, no intention, and everything we know about the future, which are built with an allative marker, a verb or something else, goes in quite the opposite, because we have a generalization proposed by Bybee. But first, we needed to establish that is this heir, which is sometimes translated destined to or meant to, does not have this semantic, but has a broader semantic. So what we did is a semantic map of allative meaning, meaning associated with allative marker, and showed that the preposition heir actually covers a large area of this semantic map. Then you go to the generalization suggested by Bybee et al. In 1994, which says that movement verbs go through intention before expressing prediction. And at this point, you did not prove anything, but you're like, if it behaves like movement verb, but that's not a movement verb, then we should go through intention first before the expression of prediction. And so what we did is a survey of the type of allative future. And you have the classical type with venitive and andative verbs. And then we found in the literature several interesting cases, like Mongolian, where you have a copula and a purpose clause which express the future. And then even better, in Minangkabau, you just have the allative preposition, which is used without any kind of copula or verb, and which express a regular predictive future. And then you put everything into a single chart, and using this concept of allative future, you redefine it in order to cover both the verbal expression and the prepositional expression or postposition, it doesn't matter. And you can say that all these verbs might follow the same grammaticalization path, okay? But then you need to prove it, and at least Egyptian material allows to prove it. And surveying all the evidence available for the Old Kingdom, we were able to show that we have a progressive relaxation of the selectional restriction and the construction. First, it's only first person animate intentional subject, and then it extends to other type of subject, other types of predicate, in order to get to the future predictive meaning by Middle Egyptian. So this, for me, is a nice illustration of how both the philological approach and the typological approach can enrich each other in redefining the meaning of a construction on one hand, and in establishing a comparative concept on the other hand. A more recent work deal with the basic vocabulary and the assumed constant rate of morpheme decay. I'm going to explain what this means. First, let me give you some background. We were working on the Egyptianness of the Coptic basic vocabulary. And Coptic, of course, is massively influenced by Greek in the domain of the lexicon. And on this basis, linguists, philologists, historians make assumptions about the nature and extent of bilingualism. But it's difficult to draw a conclusion from texts written mostly by bilingual scribe and highly influenced by a translation language. So what we would like to know, it's a bit what's the bilingual situation in Egypt at the time, studying the basic vocabulary. So we took the weighted list of basic vocabulary provided by Uri Tadmor and Martin Aspelmat, and what we did is look in Egyptian what would be the word who would express this meaning. And we found 233 Egyptian Coptic lexemes that lexicalize this 100 meaning, and the vast majority of them as cognates in pre-Coptic Egyptian, with only 10 lexemes having an unknown etymology. And based on a questionnaire submitted to Coptologist colleagues and on the lemma list kindly provided by Sebastian Richter, we also extracted the Greek Coptic lexeme for this 100 meaning. And the general result is that we ended up with 19 lexeme for 15 meaning, but in terms of frequency, only I mean, the 4 thick first lexeme are actually frequent in text. So what it tells us is that as a language, if you take on all the 19 Greek lexeme or only the 5 more frequent, which are likely to belong to the basic vocabulary, actually Coptic rank quite normally in the mid-zone of the borrower for basic vocabulary. So depending on whether one can consider all the Greek lexeme or not. But more interesting, because of the long history of... more interesting, no, I mean, that's interesting, but the long history of Egyptian, we were able to track the earliest attestation for each of these words. And you see that the result is that, of course, some goes back pretty far in the past to the Old Kingdom, and then the renewal of the basic vocabulary is not the same for each period. For the New Kingdom, for the Middle Kingdom, it's rather low. New Kingdom, higher. Late period, rather low. And then again, higher for Coptic. And if you look more in details regarding the type of the categories, you see that noun and verbs are the main responsible for this peak, both in the New Kingdom and in Coptic. Why is this interesting for general linguistics? Because you have this paper which we heard about thanks to Sebastian, the basis of glottochronology by Liège. And one thing he assumed for his reasoning, we shall assume that this rate R is also constant in time. And said, this assumption will have to be verified by the data. Then we go to section 3.2 and see how he verifies this. And it would be necessary, he says, to measure the rate constant for a given language. And says, we don't have the data, it's not possible. Perhaps for, he said, yeah, perhaps for Assyro-Babylonian, but I don't have access to the data. But the whole reasoning about glottochronology is based on a constant rate, right? And so once you realize that for Egyptian, the renewal is not constant and is dependent on part of speech and on time and period, and of course the New Kingdom and the close relationship with the Middle East of Egypt and a lot of new vocabulary coming from this region, and also the cultural impact in Coptic of new lexeme coming from Greek and the Judeo-Christian world in general. I mean, it might be related culturally. At least this has to be investigated. But this shows that this kind of constant rate of morpheme decay, at least Egyptian questions it, right? And then finally, in order to not to answer, but to make an echo to Martin Aspel-Matt's talk, historical linguistic accounting for a rare linguistic situation. So it's been repeatedly observed that there is a worldwide preference for suffixes as opposed to prefixes. Now, we know this is disputable, and actually our study shows why this is somehow disputable, this notion of prefixes and suffixes, because you need to define bound morphemes with respect to word, and that's not so easy. So we took the parameter of Dreyer in the World Atlas of Language Structure and applied them for Coptic. So the preference goes like this. In blue, that's the preference for suffixes, or predominantly or small preference, and red is for prefixes. So here are the strong prefixes, prefixing languages. And then what we did is to rank Coptic according to these criteria. And what we end up with is that Coptic has a prefixing score of 92.3, whereas in the World Atlas of Language Structure, it was described as a bit prefixing language, but not more. So this shows also how it's difficult to account for the situation of prefix versus suffix. But what's interesting is that it ranks Coptic among the 6% of languages with this dispreferred structure, right? And it has actually the highest prefixing score in Dreyer's 969 language sample. And then we argue, actually, that this uncommon situation is actually the result of perfectly regular processes of language change, but which affect construction by construction each of the features which are taken into account by Dreyer. And so we show that from earlier Egyptian, which has a moderate suffixing preference, we go to Coptic with a high prefixing preference with the intermediary stage, and all construction evolving at different speed and with different processes of language change involved. And it also shows that we do not have a broad Saperian drift like it can be described, abrupt change, but rather construction by construction, something very regular. So, conclusion. Of course, a lot of philological work still needs to be done, and thanks to the support of De Gruyter, we are about to publish this year the first 2 volumes of the companion to Ancient Egyptian about possession and nonverbal predication, and we hope that after the volume published by Sebastian, Martin and Eitan, it will be the next step in the dialogue between the two fields. And I focused here today in my talk on the impact of typology on the description of the language, but of course this is not the only place where it has had an impact recently. And I just want to mention, because we are here in Jerusalem, what the discussion between a broader framework between how the graphemics have been described in Egyptian and what's available nowadays as conceptual tool for dealing with determinatives or classifier has brought to us in the recent year. And so that's not the end of the story. Thank you for your attention.